population if we don't reduce those mortalities. We are not excused from taking action. However, it is certainly understandable that fishermen and other regulated stakeholders are resistant to taking responsibility without direct observations that they are responsible. Where are the entanglements occurring and at what rate? Our current empirical observations are insufficient to describe where right whale entanglements events are occurring. In some years recently, there have been up to 100 new entanglement scars documented, and 85% of the right whale population carries scars. But in nearly 1,500 entanglement incidents investigated by the New England Aquarium, fewer than 10% have still carried gear. And where gear was observed or retrieved, most did not have distinguishing marks that could be traced to a fishery. Fewer than 20 could be traced to the original fishing location, including less than a dozen in US waters. And it's been 5 years since the last entanglement that was definitively identified to US gear. Given improvements in marking and increased surveillance in Canada, in recent years, there have been a larger proportion of incidents identified as occurring in Canadian fishing gear, but it remains unclear how observed versus unobserved incidents are related. Again, fishermen are understandably frustrated by the lack of empirical evidence in US gear contribution to entanglement incidents, but given the number of incidents occurring annually, the amount of rope in US waters, our apportionment estimates are that if 30% of the entanglements that cause mortality and serious injury occur in US waters, and the unseen mortalities are occurring at the same rate as the documented entanglement and vessel strike mortality and serious injuries, more than 40% additional risk reduction is needed for US commercial fishery right whale mortalities and serious injuries to be reduced to the mandatory PBR of 0.7 per year. Tagging has been identified as a recovery priority for right whales in various NIMS right whale recovery initiatives, further supported by scenario planning. Stakeholders have also asked that we tag whales. Can tagging fill the data gaps that we need for management? A challenge of our current models is they use data from past observations and records. Empirical data currently, including sightings and acoustic data, are used to ground truth those models. Tagging data, if it could be collected safely, would provide important additions to real-time empirical data sources, and over time, with increased sample size, inform our understanding of how whales travel between aggregations and provide some clues about where the rarely seen whales are going. Thank you. Tried to stay under my 5 minutes.
Good job, Colleen. Now we'll turn to Clay.
Hey, Kim, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great. And I can't see my slides, so I don't know if they're up or if I need to share my screen.
Can you share your screen, please?
Yeah, let's try that. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hey everyone, my name's Clay George. I was involved in field deployments of limpet dark tags on North Atlantic right whales in the Southeast US during my previous job with the state of Georgia. Earlier this year, I joined the team at NOAA Fisheries Southeast Region. So now I'm working on the management side of the issue. I'd like to give you our take on the management needs that tagging can help inform and some lessons we've learned from tagging in the Southeast US to date. And by we, I mean primarily NOAA Southeast Region, but also the cooperators who have helped with this work to date. In 2010, a badly entangled right whale was spotted off the coast of Florida, and the decision was made to sedate it to facilitate the disentanglement response. We needed to understand if the whale survived the effects of sedation, and we were fortunate to get assistance from Russ Andrews' team and permission from the NOAA Permits Office to deploy a limpet tag on this whale. The whale ultimately died from its entanglement, but the tag confirmed that the whale survived being sedated, traveling an average of 2.7 knots over a 6-day period. Afterward, we began thinking about management needs in the Southeast and whether limpet tags could help answer any of those questions and identify areas where whales were at risk from human activities. The calving habitat off Florida and Georgia is one of the best studied areas of the right whale range, thanks to decades of intensive aerial survey monitoring. The area is also home to a substantial commercial and recreational vessel traffic presence, military training, hopper dredging, and other human activities. Seasonal speed limits and other restrictions have been implemented in areas of highest whale use, but when whales swim beyond those management boundaries, there are typically few, if any, protections. Emerging activities like wind energy and aquaculture could add to these risks in the future. And of course, every whale that migrates to the Southeast has to migrate through the mid-Atlantic US twice, where they are exposed to similar threats and a patchwork of protected and unprotected areas. Most of what we know about whale movements on the calving grounds has been inferred from visual observations, suction cup tagging, and from sequential resights of individual whales during calving seasons. We have a decent sense of whale swim speeds, surface intervals, and residency times accordingly. But we know very little about the whale's actual movements. Right whales, including mother-calf pairs, have been spotted well offshore of the calving habitat, in the Gulf of Mexico, and in estuaries and harbors where there are no vessel speed limits. It's not uncommon for individual mom-calf pairs to be spotted only once or twice during a calving season. So where were these animals the rest of the time? The point is, there are fundamental gaps in our knowledge, even in the locations where we monitor right whales the most intensively. We need higher confidence in whale movements to improve marine spatial planning, mitigation plans, and other management actions, both to reduce risk to whales and to avoid overly broad constraints on human activities. To start getting at these issues, in 2015, excuse me, we commenced a limpet tagging study in the Southeast US working with Russ Andrews and our Southeast partners. We had 3 goals. 1, to see if limpet tags could work effectively on right whales. 2, to assess the effects of tags on tagged whales. And 3, to investigate whale movements as they leave the Southeast and migrate north through the mid-Atlantic. We focused on tagging males, juveniles, and other non-calving whales because their residency times are shorter and therefore more likely to migrate north after tagging. Attachment duration was shorter than we hoped, averaging 11 days, but we were able to see some potential patterns in migratory movements and to identify areas of heightened risk. All 7 tagged whales were observed after shedding their tags and no negative health impacts were noted. We ended the project early after 2 seasons because the number of whales migrating to the Southeast US declined markedly starting in 2017. As such, we have yet to answer many of the questions we set out to answer, especially for calving females. We would be interested in resuming tagging efforts, including tagging calving females, if a new design becomes available that has longer attachment durations and is first shown to be safe in other demographic groups. Many lessons were learned from our short study, but 4 are particularly relevant today. First, it's important to consider the demographic groups you're targeting and make sure that field teams can actually identify them before deploying tags. Second, a robust pre-tagging health assessment protocol should be required to minimize the likelihood of tagging whales that are in poor health. Third, post-tagging tracking of tagged whales is critical so we can detect any long-term negative effects of tagging throughout the species range. This means submitting photos of tagged whales to the consortium photo ID catalog promptly so those IDs can be disseminated to field teams throughout the US and Canada. Lastly, most of us are focused on studying movements and behavior of normal whales for research, but improved tags are also needed for enhancement purposes, like tracking entangled and out of habitat whales. Thank you for the time and appreciate the opportunity to be able to participate.
Thanks, Clay. Okay, Sean, you're up. Do you have slides? No. Okay. You can go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
We can.
Okay. I'll start by saying my comments represent my personal views and are not a shared consensus of my colleagues at Northeast Fisheries Science Center or NOAA Fisheries. 131, the number of right whales we estimated died between 2010 and 2016 before we were able to confirm new foraging habitats and partial sources and locations of new mortality in 2017. 110, the number of whales that have died between 2017 and 2020 while we started to figure out what to do about it. At least 74 of those 110 just disappeared. 50, the percent of the population that has died since its peak while we relied solely on planes, boats, and hydrophones to identify where whales were. 400,000, the number of square kilometers of marine habitat right whales are likely to occupy. $50 million to $1 billion, the potential annual cost in dollars to actually survey the amount of area with the necessary rigor to understand where the animals are and their threats are by using visual and passive acoustic methods. 5, the number of human lives in a typical NOAA survey plane that could be lost if we attempted to significantly increase our aerial effort to understand where the animals are. 50, the approximate number of written high-level congressional and political inquiries in recent years expressing concerns that NIMS doesn't know where the problem is and is unfairly regulating their citizens and local economies. 6, the number of years Congress paused further regulation on the lobster fishery until better certainty on the distributions and innovative gear technologies could be developed. This and the previous point are an indicator that there's a limit to just how far society will allow protections of right whales to go without better certainty. Aerial surveys are a fantastic tool for conducting mark and recapture-based assessment surveys. Basically, the equivalent of putting a camera in front of all the bars, supermarkets, and coffee shops to census a population. We regularly achieve greater than 90% detection of the population with our current effort. And between the US and Canada, we've actually increased that effort probably fourfold since 2016 alone. We still don't know where most of the animals are most of the time or where they experience lethal events. Management efforts have placed tough restrictions, including fishing closures, gear changes, vessel speed reductions, and moved shipping lanes in areas where whales congregate in high numbers, and this is helpful. However, the vast majority of threats to right whales potentially occur in areas where they are exhibiting relatively solitary behavior and are also almost invisible to our aerial and acoustic equipment. Without an understanding of how dispersed or concentrated whales are outside of a few seasonal aggregations, we can't advise managers on whether to make surgical or regional management efforts versus large-scale, spatially resilient solutions. And there are constant stakeholder and political pressure to always do the latter, or always do the former, somewhere else, and rarely the latter. To adequately understand how these animals are distributed relative to the threats, we really need a three-method approach. The visual tools discussed, boats, aerial surveys, and eventually satellite imagery, acoustics, and well as satellite tagging, a small subset of the population each year to get a sense of how they're distributing. Passive acoustic and visual surveys, and even the emerging satellite imagery and eDNA technologies are essentially just presence-absence detectors. We check a box in a small piece of habitat that we invest resources in to monitor at some point in space and time. And each method has some logistical limitations. We obviously get additional information like ID, health condition, etc., but we have relatively few of all of the potential boxes monitored. And we prioritize our investment to areas where we as humans think they, the whales, are most likely to be. If the problem is occurring somewhere else far away from our survey assets, we fall victim to the classic metaphor of looking for dropped keys under a streetlight because that is where we can see, when we know we dropped our keys somewhere beyond the lighted area. Our dependency on the use of visual surveys and passive acoustics tools represent two legs of a stool which has fallen over so badly we have lost 50% of the population in 10 years. The only way to stand that stool back up and provide the missing data to inform management decisions and actions is to tag some of the animals. We are a terrestrial animal using our best combination of intuition and analytics to understand where an aquatic animal chooses to go through presence-absence detection methods. Tagging is the only way we can ask the animal to show us where it chooses to go and is the critical missing element needed to understand the true distribution of the population in time and space and its subsequent exposure to risk and guide subsequent visual and acoustic survey efforts in a targeted way. I'm not here to argue that tagging has no risk. I'm here to argue that unless we do something different, any whale we do or do not tag is probably going to be dead in 10 to 15 years anyway, from a rope or a boat, and we still won't know where it happened. That's all I got.
Thanks. Okay, Amy. And don't forget, try to talk to the owl.
Okay, all right. So I've had the privilege of studying the North Atlantic right whale for 40 years, and I've assisted in various tasks as curator of the right whale photo identification catalog. Does a lot of work to keep track of tagging events carried out by the various research teams. And we've also evaluated the health effects observed from tags and have reported on that in the past. I want to put forward at the outset of this meeting that we at the New England Aquarium have considerable concerns about the continuation of implantable tagging of this critically endangered species that is declining in health and population size. We believe that the potential benefits that invasive tagging might provide are outweighed by the potential health impacts to individual whales. We also question whether tagging data will, in practice, effectively and efficiently improve the management measures necessary to reduce the chances of species extinction. If implantable tagging does continue on this species, it will be critical to determine in advance whether, one, there are any questions that can only be answered by tagging, i.e. there are no alternative non-invasive measures that could do that, and two, whether the answers to those questions will improve management measures to conserve this species. We offer the following suggestions to consider as conversations about tagging continue. We believe it is critical about a retro which measures all tagging data collected from all sources to understand lessons learned and whether management measures have been better informed as a result of previous tagging efforts. We also believe it is crucial to carry out in-depth assessments of all implantable tagged whales, which now numbers 100 through 2023, using all available techniques, including visual assessments, photogrammetry, and hormone data to evaluate the impacts of invasive tags. It is not appropriate to use assessments of tagging in southern right whales as a comparison, since North Atlantic right whales are smaller, have thinner blubber layers, and are facing multiple additional stressors. If tagging proceeds, there should be a clear study designed to determine how many animals need to be tagged to obtain the objective of the study. And we feel it is important to restrict any tagging to males, as females in this species are showing lower survival rates and are more challenged by other stressors due to energetic requirements of calving. To do this will require the involvement of a right whale researcher on the vessel who can identify individuals in real time. This person should also be knowledgeable about health indicators in right whales to ensure whales in compromised health are not tagged. There are qualified individuals from several organizations who could do this. Follow-up surveys to relocate the whale post-tagging should be required. These surveys would serve two purposes. First, they would allow for photographic assessments of the tag site to assess physiological response. Based surveys should be conducted to allow for close-up photographs, as well as the ability to collect hormone data to assess stress. And second, the tagged whale may lead researchers to previously unknown whale aggregations. To accomplish this second purpose, the surveys must be flexible enough to go far from shore. And management needs. Tagging in the Northeast US and Canada may provide additional insights into how whales move through these regions where the level of fishing activity is highest along the eastern seaboard and the biggest threat to this species. Whether this information will improve management is unclear to us, as in our opinion, management should be focused on implementing measures that will make fishing in use. Dynamic management has been shown time and again to not be adequate for eliminating risk. And lastly, all tagging data should be compared to distribution models to see if tagged whale movements coincide with modeled distribution. So we appreciate the opportunity to share our concerns and our ideas about tagging gaps and look forward to continuing conversations. Thanks.
Did you want to keep running company?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Erin Meyer-Gutt-Broad from the University of South Carolina, and I'm here to talk about what are some gaps in knowledge that tags could help fill in, and most of my work thinks more about prey. The reason that I think prey is really important and not just focusing on ship strikes and entanglements is because where right whales are distributed is largely a function of where their prey is. They have a few behaviors like surface active groups when they're breeding or migrating to the Southeast US calving ground to give birth that are not prey related. But the rest of their annual distribution is really focused on where is the food. And prey is extremely dynamic. We've seen it shift. We've seen the zooplankton that right whales feed on shift distribution with both natural and anthropogenic climate change. There are large-scale circulation patterns that drive the supply and abundance of zooplankton, including the Labrador Current from the north, the Gulf Stream from the south, and how those interact with bringing prey into the Gulf of Maine. There's also more fine-scale and local processes that contribute to advecting and aggregating zooplankton into patches that are actually energetically efficient enough for right whales to forage on. So that could be bottom shape, bathymetry, tides, zooplankton behavior. Like if the zooplankton is entering diapause and then it's hibernating in a layer along the bottom. So with these things in mind, like that prey really drives right whale distribution, I came up with 4 major questions that we have, and they're questions that tags can potentially contribute to answering. They're not going to fully answer. So the first question is, what are right whales eating? Times we'll just say, oh, right whales are eating late stage Calanus finmarchicus. It's actually not that simple. In Cape Cod Bay, they're probably eating smaller copepods like centropods and pseudocalanus, which is fine. I'm on a National Academy of Sciences committee that is trying to assess the hydrodynamic impacts of putting turbines in the Nantucket Shoals region and how that's going to impact right whale prey. Well, we don't really know what right whales are feeding on in the Nantucket Shoals region. So they're probably feeding on something similar to the Cape Cod Bay prey, so these centropods and pseudocalanus complex, but we can't really answer these questions when we. Right whales have shifted recently and are using the Gulf of St. Lawrence habitat. Yes, late stage Calanus finmarchicus is up there, but so is Calanus hyperboreus, and the hyperboreus dominates in the springtime. So there's another question. We don't know what's being fed on. The second question, where in the water column are right whales feeding? This matters because it helps us understand the energetics, like how much food a right whale is getting in its mouth. Are they diving down to the deep and feeding on these diapause layers of C5, Calanus finmarchicus? Are they in the center of the water column and feeding on compressed layers of zooplankton in the middle? Are they skim feeding at the top? Understanding sort of the vertical component of their foraging distribution is important for understanding the efficacy of our visual monitoring. If they're deep, then we're not going to observe them from the surface, right? If they're shallow, because they're strike. So that's an important component to understanding these feeding behaviors. The big question is, where is prey in space and time? And so where are right whales in space and time? And of course, the great example is when they shifted, right whales shifted to start feeding in the Gulf of St. Lawrence around 2015. It triggered an unusual mortality event in 2017. When right whales were foraging where we don't expect them to be, we don't have policies in place to slow down vessels, to moderate fishing activities, et cetera, right? So that's a really classic example of prey redistributed because of a change in Gulf Stream and Labrador Current interactions in the Gulf of Maine. When prey declined in these traditional feeding habitats, right whales had to shift farther north, and a large portion of the population was killed up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So that's the obvious example, but there's others actually. So the southern New England area, the Nantucket Shoals region, BOEM has funded right whale surveys in that area and found, and it was published in 2017, that right whales are pretty much using that space in the winter and the spring. And they use those studies to design the development of wind farms in the area. However, right whale prey is changing its distribution so rapidly, it's really hard to keep up with. Now, right whales are using the southern New England habitat year round. We've seen them every month of the year. So we've got this little mismatch between the data that's driving the timing of construction of wind farms and the really modern information about right whale distribution in this region. Other things, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, this new habitat only is being occupied by about 40% of the population. Where are the rest of them going in the summer and fall? Where are right whales going in the winter? It's just a small subset that migrates to the Southeast US calving habitat. So people keep saying again and again, we don't know where right whales are. Just because we've seen in a good year 90% of the animals, that just means we've seen them once, right? Where are they the other 364 days of the year? A third of mortalities are, about a third are observed. So we actually find a carcass. The rest are unobserved, so 2/3. If right whales are using spaces that we're not protecting, that's probably really contributing to this cryptic mortality. The final thing is near and dear to my heart. If we understand prey, it helps us understand reproduction dynamics. So right whale reproduction is really tightly linked to their prey availability in the previous years. An ideal reproduction cycle looks like a 3-year cycle where a female will spend a year building up blubber, a year pregnant, and then a year nursing her calf. And in the southern right whales, that's that idealized 3-year model is reasonably accurate. In the North Atlantic right whales, the cycle takes a lot longer, like 7 years or longer than that. So if we understand how right whales are feeding, where they're feeding on, what they're feeding on, where in the water column they're feeding, it will help us understand changes in their reproduction. We talk in these workshops a lot about mortality, but there are two sides to the population. Yes, we have to prevent mortalities, but the population is only going to rebound if there's reproduction. Reproduction can also be a sneaky way to guess that there's going to be a future right whale distribution shift, right? If right whale reproduction is starting to decline, it probably means that foraging isn't going well during the rest of the year. So we can expect that right whales might shift and start using new foraging habitats to try and build up those blubber layers and get those reproduction cycles started again. So those are the main things I wanted to talk about. Tags can help answer some of these questions, but I think it goes without saying that we can't do it if it's not safe. With only 340 animals left in the population, there's absolutely no wiggle room for error. So I'm happy to take questions throughout the workshop.
Okay, so we have about 4 minutes for questions and discussion in the room. And do you want us to bring over the chair for you to sit?
That's okay.
It's only 4 minutes.
4 minutes of it.
Did I see any hands?
Add to what Clay George said in regards to the first Olympic tag that was deployed on 39. Note that there was some useful information concerning that tag happening across and it showed a very minor pathology. It was in the blubber only, which is the way that the tag is defined to use. As veterinarians, it was a very unconcerning observation.
It's sort of a question for Veronique and maybe Amy too.
Francis.
Sorry, owl, foot for owl.
Thank you.
Veronique, you mentioned sample sizes, and that to me is sort of a fascinating one because some of this weighing risks and benefits is how many, if you were to tag animals and you accept that perhaps there's a minor health effect that you're prepared to accept for this individual male for the benefit of the reproducing females, how many would you do that to? So I'm curious, you said you needed the right sample size soon. How did you decide what was the right sample size?
Well, that's a good question because I heard earlier that we should assess this before we go out. And I would answer that after the first year, where we tagged with Ross 9 animals, it was surprising to see how homogeneous the behavior of the different whales was. Then we went out a second year in 2022. It was an odd year for many whales, and the whales were very. I'll solve this. Talk to me. So the second year, the whales were again in 2 different periods, very homogeneous in their behavior, but totally different behavior than the first year we went out. And this summer, and it's still preliminary results, again, the 6 whales tagged were very homogeneous in their behavior, but similar to 2019, not last year. So after the first year, you say, okay, it's too homogeneous, then maybe we don't capture all the variability, we'll go back. And then you have the second year that is totally at the opposite in terms of what you observe. So we went back again this year saying, okay, well, we need to figure out, is last year an exception or 2019? And we had the food around it. So to try to understand what was going on. So I think it's difficult to have a how do you say that, a hard sample size before you actually go out and start collecting your data, because you find out that this variability might be different than what you predicted.
from the start. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
Scott Krause. Actually, this sample size discussion is at the core of some concerns about tagging, which is that you got a few number of animals to tag if you're restricting it to males only. And one thing that the photo identification data over 40 years has shown is incredible flexibility on the part of the animals. So some years, for example, in the Bay of Fundy, many of the whales were grubbing around in the mud on the ocean floor because all copepods were down there, and we dropped ROVs to see all those copepods, and they were a couple of meters thin. But then another year, you might not see any whales from mud. And then if you look at the sightings distributions, there's always weird animals that, you know, one will end up in the Azores, one's end up in Iceland. Many of these disappearing whales are probably traveling to places, just kind of exploring what the options are for feeding or finding mates or, you know, doing all that stuff. It's males and females. So even if you picked a sample size, let's say you wanted to tag 25 whales, you have no idea what, when you tag them, it's kind of luck of the draw where that whale is going to go. And it probably doesn't inform the next. And one animal will not inform what the other animals do. And one demographic group is not homogeneous in terms of its distribution or its movements. So it's very worrisome. The sample size question is very worrisome because you don't know what it means at the end of the day. Short term, I can buy that in terms of correcting visibility assessments and all that stuff. That makes good sense. Long term, these movements are highly variable, and right whales are incredibly good at adapting to whatever. Well, we don't know what they're adapting to, but they're modifying their search images for courtship groups, for social interactions, for food constantly. And I think it's going to be a real challenge to use tag data other than in the short term for actually assessing what right whales do.
Okay, I do see Sean has his hand up as well online.
I think the sample size question is a really, really fair and valid point, but I think we need to apply that to all of our methods in terms of how we're best going to do it. We basically are just doing more aerial survey and more boats and more acoustics, but we don't actually have a power analysis of how much of that survey effort do we need to truly understand where the animals are. And for instance, you know, I just a back of the envelope, a typical aerial survey can cover 2,500 to 3,000 square kilometers, which is less than 1% of their habitat, in a survey lasting 4 hours, which is 0.05% of a year. And one plane can fly maybe 600 hours per year. And that's 6% of a year's time. So, you know, how do we go answer to the opening speaker's presentation, the question of, it's not the method, it's the question. And the question is, how do we find out where we go or where these animals are going when they're not in their hotspots? And, to do that with aerial surveys and acoustics is an extremely expensive proposition. So, but the sample size issue with taggings is the same conundrum. So.
Okay, we actually are on time because we were 5 minutes behind, but we probably do need to break for the break. And I think the snacks are out in.
Yeah, right out on the side here. Again, bathrooms, if you go out the door, past the elevators and then around to the right, you'll find the bathroom. So coffee machine, and then snacks right here.
Thank you, panel. Great job. I think we're still missing a few people, but they're gonna come in. We are off mute on the owl, right?
Just unmuted.
Okay, Amy, don't forget, talk to the owl. And Amy Sloan is going to start us off with talking about the permitting side of things. And she's from NOAA Fisheries from our Office of Protected Resources.
Thanks, Kim, and thank you to the steering committee for having me. I'm going to give a brief introduction to our program, focusing on the U.S. laws and regulations applicable to tagging endangered large whales in the United States. I'll summarize the permit process and what happens after a permit is issued, and then talk a little bit about the permits we have for tagging North Atlantic right whales. So we are within the NOAA Fisheries or National Marine Fisheries Service Office of Protected Resources. You all know Kim now as our office director and Catherine Marzan as our deputy director. Some of you may know Jolie Harrison. She's our division chief, and she and Ben Laws oversee the incidental take program. I oversee the directed take program. Our program implements permits under Section 10A1A of the Endangered Species Act and Section 104 of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. At any given time, we manage about 200 different permits for scientific research primarily, but other activities for cetaceans, pinnipeds excluding walrus, and endangered species including sawfish, sea turtles in water, and sturgeon. I want to highlight our cetacean tagging team, Shasta McClanahan and Amy Hageman, who are here virtually. Shasta is the primary lead for North Atlantic right whale research permits, and she coordinates cetacean permitting under an endangered species programmatic consultation, which I'll talk about in a moment. Amy is a senior biologist and policy analyst who has a broader role for consistency among all of those permits, but she works closely with Shasta on the tagging permits. So under the U.S. laws that are most applicable to tagging large whales and right whales are the Endangered Species Act and Marine Mammal Protection Act. In the 1970s to conserve species in their habitats. But one of the things I wanted to highlight when I was looking at that Congress recognized the need for both acts prohibit take. Most of you are probably familiar with that terminology. And I've highlighted the terms that are most relevant to tagging. So under the ESA, harass and harm, and under the MMPA, harass. Harassment is further broken down. As an agency, we have an interim interpretation of harass through a policy directive, which is an activity that creates the likelihood of injury by annoying an animal to an extent that it significantly disrupts its normal behavioral patterns. And under the ESA, our regulations, harm is defined as an activity that actually kills or injures wildlife. Under the MMPA, we have level A and level B harassment. Level B harassment is any act of pursuit, torment, or annoyance, which has the potential patterns. And then MMPA level A harassment has that potential to injure. In some cases, I'll mention, we may authorize level B harassment for an activity such as photo identification that may not rise to the level of ESA harassment. There are limited exceptions to the take prohibitions. And for our program, it's the Section 10A1A and MMPA Section 104 permits for scientific research and enhancement. Tagging endangered cetaceans is primarily done under scientific research permits. An exception is enhancement, which was mentioned earlier, under the Marine Mammal Health and Stranding Response Program. In certain situations, during response activities, under Section MMPA, under MMPA Section 109H and ESA Section 10A1A enhancement, tagging may occur. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm focusing on scientific research. So first, I'm going to cover the statutory requirements, and then I'll get into the regulatory requirements. So under the ESA, issuance of a permit is a federal action that requires consultation under Section 7 of the ESA. The resulting biological opinion will determine whether the existence of the species or adversely modified designated critical habitat. Under Section 10 of the ESA, faith in that the activity cannot operate to the disadvantage of the species and must be consistent with the purposes and policy of the ESA, which gets back to conservation. Under Section 104 of the MMPA, the research has to be bona fide and humane. This applies to all marine mammals, not just endangered marine mammals. So the definition of bona fide is that the research is likely to be published, or it's likely to provide basic knowledge of marine mammal biology or ecology, or it's likely to identify, evaluate, or resolve conservation problems. And the definition of humane is that method which involves the least possible degree of pain and suffering feasible to the animal involved. So under the regulations, under the ESA regulations for permitting, it actually states that permits for endangered marine mammals shall be processed under the MMPA regulations. So these are the MMPA regulations. These right here are general for all marine mammals, whether they're endangered or not. So it reiterates the humane requirement, but it also says that the activity cannot present unnecessary risks to the health and welfare of the marine mammals involved. The activity by itself or in combination with other activities will not likely have a significant adverse impact on the species. And we look at the expertise of the people involved, their facilities and resources available to ensure they're adequate for them to achieve their objectives. For endangered marine mammals, our regulations have a higher bar. And some of these you'll see are very similar to what we just saw. But for here, the applicant has to show that why they have to use an endangered species and that they can't get the work done using a non-endangered species. And that they will not likely have a long-term direct or indirect adverse impact on the species. For endangered marine mammals, in addition, one of these criteria needs to be met. So it either has to contribute to a research need or objective in a recovery plan, or in these next two bullets, you'll see mirror the bona fide definition, but with the addition of the word significantly. Significantly contribute to understanding the basic biology or ecology of the species, or significantly help with identifying, evaluating, or resolving conservation problems, or fulfilling a critically important research need. Other applicable laws, and I'll just touch on these briefly. The Animal Welfare Act applies to federal research facilities that get, research facilities that receive federal funding. And in those cases, they need to have an institutional animal care and use committee approval. And we do use those approvals to support a humane determination. If you're flying drones to tag whales, you need to follow FAA regulations. The National Environmental Policy Act applies to issuance of our permits, and I'll touch on that in a moment. And if you're flying drones or discharging tags in a sanctuary process, it can take anywhere from 6 to 12 months, and I'll talk about the disparity there. So applications are submitted for cetacean permits if they are covered under a programmatic consultation on a cycle, either May 1st or November 1st. We have an online system called Come In. They're assigned to 2 analysts. The analysts review against our application instructions to ensure the applications are complete. So it's an iterative process at this point. We're also looking at what is the appropriate level of NEPA under the National Environmental Policy Act. And is this activity indeed going to fit under a programmatic consultation? If it fits under a programmatic consultation, it fits under umbrella for our entire program. We do not have to do an individual consultation. That's where we can typically issue a permit in 6 months if it falls under that programmatic. If it falls outside of the programmatic, the process can take about 12 months. So we're making our initial NEPA analysis and determining what consultation is needed at this early phase. Once the application is complete, we put it out in a Federal Register notice for a 30-day public comment period. And concurrently, we send it to the Marine Mammal Commission, who has 45 days by regulation to review. But we also send it to our internal agency experts within our science centers and our managers in our regions. We send it to other agencies, such as state agencies that we cooperate with. And sometimes we solicit expert reviews from non-NIPS or non-federal reviewers. After the close of the comment period and all the comments come in, what we do is we compile those. We figure out what does the agency need to respond to and what does the applicant. It's documented in our administrative record. And we complete the supporting analysis, so the NEPA analysis. One thing I'll mention about our NEPA analysis in the US and for our permits, scientific research permits are in general categorically excluded from the need to prepare an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. And this is based on a robust administrative record of hundreds of environmental assessments with findings of no significant impact. But we do look at each permit application as it comes in. So anything that's new or novel might get up to an EA. And then we put this all together and we present it to Kim for a decision to issue or deny. And the issuance, you know, it's rarely denied, but the issuance that includes what mitigation is appropriate for that activity. And a lot of that depends on the comments that we get. So, and the comments that we get also inform the questions that we were talking about of, is this needed for recovery? Those are the kind of comments that we're looking for to get from our agency experts. I just wanted to mention our online application system, because on the left-hand bar, there's a search feature. So during the comment period, the general public can go to apps and can see the application open for public comment and review it, and anybody can comment on this. After the permit's issued, these applications are still there. We don't have a function for putting the permits up online yet, but it's something that we're going to be looking into. And our applicants, our permit holders, once they're permit holders, they report via apps. Those yet are not available to the public, but that's another thing we're looking into. So once the permit is issued, since we're here in the Washington, D.C. area, we look to our regions to help facilitate coordination among the researchers. So the researchers have to contact the regions 2 weeks in advance and then work with them on coordination. The permit holders are also required to coordinate with each other. And our understanding is the Rightwell researchers are a well-coordinated community. For another important component that's a permit requirement is reporting. So for our annual reports, and if permits are issued under a programmatic cycle, the reports all come in at the same time, and we actually compile a report of all of the permit holders, and we could get to look at this cumulatively, which has been really helpful with the change to programmatic permitting. But it looks at the number of takes. They'll summarize what research was done, what research wasn't done, and why. So COVID was a huge impact over the past few years. Preliminary findings, impacts that they've observed, how they coordinated, any problems they encountered. And then we do ask specific information about invasive tagging. So there's an actual separate module for those people who are authorized for invasive tagging, including successful and unsuccessful deployments and post-tagging monitoring, which is required. Incident reports are required if they exceed their take limits or if serious injury or mortality is observed. And in those cases, they have to stop research in 2 weeks. We use this information to not only monitor permit compliance, but to evaluate the impacts and ensure that they're within what we've analyzed previously. And we do have the ability to modify permits if needed. It's rare where we revoke a permit. But it's not uncommon to add conditions to a permit if something unusual happens and it's necessary. With regard to the right well permits that we have 5 permits that authorize tagging. 4 of them authorize dart and suction cup, and 1 is suction cup only. We've got 60 dart tags authorized total across all permits, no more than 1 per animal. 225 suction cup tags, but that is up to 3 tags per animal, so it's not 225 individual animals. With regard to restrictions, tags cannot penetrate deeper than the blubber layer for right whales. No reproductive females, no calves less than 6 months, and they need to avoid animals in poor health or that are compromised. In order to do that, they're required to take reasonable measures to identify an individual prior to tagging. So along the lines of what Amy was talking about. And dart tags must be sterile before use. And if there is contamination, they need to cease tagging. And then additionally, with right whales, researchers must report dart tagging within 24 hours to us in the Marine Mammal Health and Stranding Response Program to help monitor the population and with tracking of the unusual mortality event. We've been talking with our regions about how we can better coordinate on that. But that includes the date, where the tag is on the body, the ID of the animal, and photographs, so people can be on the lookout for them. And they are required to conduct follow-up monitoring on tag wound reaction, healing, any breakage, animal health and behavior, etc. That's all I have. And it's next over to my colleague in Canada.
Thank you very much, Amy. Can you hear me out?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. And is everybody in person seeing my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks. So hi, everybody. I'm Laurence Deneau-Tremblay. I'm a senior biologist working at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada in the Species at Risk program, and I'm from Quebec Administrative Region, as you can hear by my accent. I will be presenting you today the Canadian legal context for permitting tagging activities on marine mammals, and especially on at-risk species such as North Atlantic right whales. Going to the next slides. Sorry about that. Can't seem to understand what's going on there. Okay, great. So I'm, without looking at the whole Canadian regulatory context, I would like to let you know today that the tagging of marine mammals need to be authorized under 1 or 2 different acts or regulations in Canada, depending on the species that are targeted and if drones are to be used in order to photo IDs individuals or even for deploying tags. So the first act under which tagging activities have to be authorized is the Species at Risk Act for at-risk species, as well as the Marine Mammal Regulations, which are under the Fisheries Act. So during my presentation, I will talk about the legal context, the general prohibitions, as well as the conditions of those 2 acts and regulations. So first of all, SARA, or the Species at Risk Act, was first enacted in 2002, and the main purposes of SARA are to prevent wildlife species from becoming extirpated or extinct, to provide for the recovery of wildlife species that are at risk as a result of human activity, and to manage species of special concern to prevent them from becoming endangered or threatened. The way it works is that wildlife species are first assessed at risk by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, which is the COSEWIC, after which these species may or may not be listed under the Schedule 1 of SARA, which is the official list for which protection measures are implemented on at-risk species. So in the little pyramid you have here, you can see the different status COSEWIC, the different COSEWIC, the different status that can be given to a species by the COSEWIC. And on your left, you have the different SARA status that go from special concern to extirpated. So if we first look at SARA's general prohibition, it is important to know that those prohibitions do come into effect at the moment at-risk species are listed under Schedule 1 of SARA. So the first general prohibition is Section 32, which prohibits the killing, arming, harassing, capturing, taking, possessing, collecting, buying, selling, or trading of individual or any parts of individual that are endangered, threatened, or extirpated species. Section 33 of SARA prohibits any damage or destruction of listed species residences, while Section 58 allows for a legal protection of a species' critical habitat when a ministerial order is signed. It is important to note that SARA prohibitions don't apply to species listed as special concern. For those and for non-listed species, other laws and regulations apply. So knowing that those prohibitions do exist under SARA, it is also important for me to mention that Section 73 also allows for permits to be issued in order to authorize certain activities that would otherwise contravene the prohibitions I just presented. There are three categories of activity that can be authorized under SARA. The first one being any activity that is considered scientific research that is related to the conservation of the species and conducted by qualified person. So any tagging activities, biopsies, or any vessel approach in order to take photographs would be considered at some point some scientific research and would fall into this category. The second category of activities that can be authorized under SARA are any activities that would benefit the species or are required to enhance its chance of survival in the wild. This would include any emergency or disentanglement activities, the need, for example, to relocate an individual, public education activities, as well as media-based activities. Finally, the last category is for activities that may affect incidentally and at-risk species. This would include, for example, any directed scientific research that would target a non-listed species, but that at the same time would incidentally affect an at-risk species. So once it has been determined that a proposed activity in a permit application do fall under one of those three categories at least, Section 73 of SARA also requires that all preconditions are met before being able to issue a permit. So I will present you the three main preconditions of SARA. First one being that all reasonable alternative to the activity that would reduce the impact on the species have been considered and that the best solution has been adopted. So this is the part in a permit application where in DFO, we look if any other activities or technical of research design were considered by the permit applicant. And we are also looking at the reasons why the proposed activities were the ones that were chosen. We are also looking to see if other locations or timelines have been considered or if conducting the proposed activities on other species, so for example, non-at-risk species, have been considered. This is also where we look if there's any linkages with other scientific projects and collaboration with other researchers in order to reduce the impact of the proposed activities on a species. It has happened that two research crew were, for example, able to collaborate and use the same vessel in order to conduct their respective activities. It has also happened that some researchers have been able to share data and samples. So at that point, this is one way among multiple other ones to reduce the impacts of a proposed activity on a species. Second precondition that need to be met is that all feasible measures will be taken in order to minimize the impact of the activity on the species or its critical habitat. So this is where a full list of specific mitigation measures that are to be used in order to minimize the impact of the proposed activity on a species need to appear in a permit application. This is also where we assess if the appropriate personnel will conduct the activities, and this is directly related to the experience and qualification of the permit applicant as well as the whole research crew. And finally, the third precondition that need to be met is that the activity will not jeopardize the survival or recovery of the species. So once we know that a proposed activity do fall under one of the three categories that can be authorized under SARA and that all SARA's preconditions have been met, then Section 73 also requires that a permit contains any terms and conditions governing the activity that would be necessary for protecting the species, minimizing the impact of the authorized activity on the species and providing for its recovery. So this is the important part here where DFO has a maximum flexibility in order to include any essential conditions in a permit in order to make sure that we are protecting the species with the goal towards their recovery kept in mind. This is also the part where a permit holder must be fully aware of the conditions that have been included in a permit, because a failure to comply with one condition on a SARA permit would result in a violation of SARA. So here I've put some examples of conditions that could be added to a permit in order to mitigate the impacts of tagging activities. So such conditions can cover a lot of aspects, going from minimal distances that would need to be respected between an individual and the vessel, also by requesting a minimal altitude for a remotely piloted aircraft system or a drone over a marine mammal, for limiting the interaction time in the presence of an individual, and also requesting that the DFO's fishery officers to be notified before the starting of activities. This is also where some conditions related only to specifically tagging activities would occur. For example, in Canada, we only authorize anchor tags and suction cup tags for tagging of North Atlantic right whales. We also request for anchors to be sterilized before being used, and we also ask that only inflatable vessels be used in order to tag. This is also where we prohibit any tagging of individuals that would be in poor physical health, or the tagging of mother and calf pairs. Such conditions can also limit the number of individuals that can be tagged, and this is also where we require a photo identification of an individual before the tagging occur, in order to make sure that he has not already been tagged. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, not only tagging activities need to be authorized under SARA for endangered species, but they also sometimes need to be authorized under the marine mammal regulations, depending if a drone is to be used. So marine mammals regulations are set out by the Government of Canada through the Fisheries Act, and Section 38 prohibits the disturbance of any marine mammal, including whales, dolphins, and seals, etc. So the marine mammal regulations prohibitions do set some minimal approach distances to marine mammals that are mandatory and that will vary under specific situations. For example, your location across the country or the species encountered. The MMR regulations, prohibitions also set some specific regulations regarding the use of an aircraft, which include any use of a remotely piloted aircraft system or drone. And this is where I want to specifically draw your attention. So the regulations state that when using an aircraft over a marine mammal, an altitude of 1,000 feet within a radius of 1/2 nautical mile from a marine mammal must be maintained at all time, and that no flight maneuver for the purpose of bringing an aircraft closer to a marine mammal shall be performed. So despite those prohibitions, there is also a section of the marine mammal regulations which allows for permit issuance in order to disturb and authorize the disturbance of a marine mammal if it contributes to marine scientific research, amongst other possibilities. So similar to SARA, the marine mammal regulations authorizations would then be subject to several conditions, which would be included in a permit and related to the species that are targeted, the manner in which these species may be disturbed, and the mitigation measures that are required to minimize the negative effects of disturbing the species. So once again, this is the part where it is absolutely crucial for a permit holder to be aware of the conditions that have been included in a permit, because a failure to comply with a condition of the marine mammal regulations authorization would result in a violation of the Fisheries Act. So if we come again around tagging activities on North Atlantic right whales, there are kind of two different scenarios that can occur. The first one being when a drone is to be used at some point around tagging activities, then a Section 38 of the Marine Mammal Regulation Authorization and Section 74 permit under SARA would be required. The magical part here is that Section 74 of SARA do authorize a permit that is issued under another act of parliament to serve as a SARA permit as long as the preconditions are met. So at that time, DFO is able to issue only one permit that would cover for the drone activities as well as the tagging activities, and that would include conditions related to both of these activities. On the other end, as a second scenario, you have where no drones are to be used for tagging activities. Then only a standalone Section 73 SARA permit would be needed, and at that time, only conditions related to tagging activities would be added to the permit. So once a permit has been issued, it does not end there. A section of all SARA permits, as well as marine mammal regulations authorization, is dedicated to conditions about reporting and monitoring. A report is usually required approximately 2 months after the activities have been carried out. And here I've just put some examples of information that are usually requested in a permit report in order for DFO to be able to monitor the activities that have been carried out and if they have been conducted the same way as mentioned when assessing the permit application. So, for example, we would request details on any interaction or sightings of a North Atlantic right whales, a brief description of the activities that have been carried out, as well as a summary of methods, including if problems were encountered, if mitigation measures have been implemented, and if improvements have been made during the carrying the activities. Similar to my colleague, I also wanted to present you an overview of the general SARA permit process. In Canada, we do assess our permit application regionally. However, each region do follow a similar assessment process and ensures that SARA preconditions have been met. So the process usually starts with DFO receiving a permit application, then a notice of receipt is sent by DFO. After that, the permit application assessment do start. We, as mentioned, assess a permit application regionally, usually. However, on the Atlantic coast, as the different administrative regions are really near from each other, we are also able to conduct interregional permit application assessment if some proposed activities are likely to occur across several regions. So during the permit application assessment, this is where we will validate if if the purpose of the activity and the preconditions of SARA are met. This is also where we will validate the experience and qualifications of the applicant as well as the whole research team. We will also validate if the activities are humane, especially for invasive activities for which an animal care protocol, an approved animal care protocol will be requested. This is also where we seek for other experts' opinions if needed, and where we consult any supporting documentation that could help us assess the risk of the proposed activities. Finally, this is also where we validate if other federal laws and regulation might apply, for example, the Marine Mammal Regulations or the Fisheries Act. Once the assessment is over, then a permit decision is being made. The three possibilities being that a permit is issued, a permit is refused, or a permit is considered as being not needed based on the information provided in the permit application. Then only if a permit is issued, the minister's explanation will be posted by DFO on the SARA public registry in order to explain what activities have been authorized and how did they met SARA's precondition. And finally, after the activities have been carried out, then a permit report would be submitted to DFO. And this is the way we can monitor what have been conducted on the field. And this is kind of an adaptive management approach, as we use this information in order to adjust, if necessary, our future permit application assessment. And finally, just before going to the period questions, I want to mention that a permit under SARA or an authorization under the Marine Mammal Regulations do not eliminate the obligation to obtain other authorizations, permits, or licenses that might be required. This includes, for example, a marine protected area activity approval should a permit applicant intend to conduct activities in a marine protected area, an approved animal care protocol, especially for invasive activities, as I mentioned before, a foreign vessel clearance, additional licenses under the Fisheries Act, if, for example, the intention is also to conduct biopsies, and any other permits required under a relevant provincial or federal act. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I think at that point, Amy and I will take questions.
You can just repeat the question. Your voice picks up well. Goes online.
You're saying I have a big mouth. Okay, Randy.
Yeah, Randy Reeves. Looks to me like a big difference between the Canadian and American systems is the lack of a public comment opportunity in Canada. Something that the US system is required to include. Is that correct?
Where are you? Oh, I need way back there. All right, so there's a question about the lack of a comment period in Canada, and whether or not the US is required to include that. Is that what you were asking? Or the way around, whether or not Canada is required to have a public comment period?
To my knowledge, there are no public comment period over permit applications in Canada, and we are not requested to do so by the law. The only thing we are requested to do is to post minister's explanation on the SARA public registry in order to in order for every Canadian to be aware of what permit have been delivered for which activities, where and how did the proposed the authorized activity met the SARA's precondition.
Okay, I think Scott had his hand up.
Scott Krabs, I just have one question. I was actually pleased to see relative consistency between the two countries' requirements. But one thing that's missing, or at least was missing from your presentation, both presentations, in the reporting side was the duration that the tag actually functioned. Because if you're doing cost benefit analyses for tags relative, relative to the questions you're asking, seems like duration is a critical component of it. And I'm just wondering if duration of the tag function is a requirement in your permitting reports.
Okay, so the question's about tag duration and whether or not it's required both in Canada and US in reporting. We'll have Laurence go first and then Amy. Okay, go ahead, Laurence.
Yeah, apologies for not discussing that aspect during my presentation, but yes, this is an information we are requesting because it helps us to obtain the best information available as to the type of tag that was chosen, why it was chosen. This is kind of helping us with the whole context, and then we can see how much, what duration was if the tag on in order to obtain some data. So this is something we also request. It was just not in the examples I've listed in my presentation. Apologies for that.
Scott, I'm looking at our report questions. It doesn't look like we phrase it specifically as how long did it last, but we are asking for the results of the tagging overall. And so I think it's applied in there, because I think that's something we could qualify better or to make sure that's there. But that is something that we want, right? Yes.
So Amy, if you're gonna answer more questions, maybe you could come up here and be closer to the owl. I don't know that the owl's picking you up. Okay, I think I saw Peter and then Michael.
So I have a very naive question about permitting for Amy, which is you listed, or you said there are a large number of limpet and suction cup tags authorized, 200 of some or 50 of something else. When you authorize tagging, is that like the maximum number they could tag that they could put out, or is that are there that many tags out? I don't know.
It's the maximum number that's authorized to be put out. So it's 60 dart, 225 suction. But the 225 is up to 3 tags per animal. So that's the maximum that can be done. It doesn't mean that that is done. Not all researchers achieve all of the tagging every year.
Michael.
And make more, both countries look to avoid tagging for health or compromised individuals. There's a significant body of published literature about the species in North Atlantic right whale being compromised, infertility, prolonged inverted intervals, reduced growth rate, and poor body condition compared to southern right whale. I just wonder, at what point does a species-wide concern about condition and health and compromise come into the individual decisions as to whether or not you're going to attack it?
It's a good question, Michael. I mean, I think right now we are depending on researchers in the field to assess the individual animals on a case-by-case basis. So they are supposed to be making those decisions, of what that animal looks like. But I think that's something that is worth contemplating, with all the experts in the room as we move on the discussion throughout the week about that specific topic. So thank you.
Other questions? Oh, were you gonna say something, Laurence?
No, I'm sorry, but I did not hear so well Michael's question. So if you could just repeat the question, so at least I have like Amy's answer related to that question.
So it was about, both of you talked about the individual health of the animals and making decisions on whether to tag, and whether or not, given that there's concerns about the whole population, the health of the whole population of right whales, if we should be making species level determinations. Did I summarize that?
I mean, basically, I listed a number of concerns about poor body condition, poor reproductive success, prolonged birth intervals, and especially reduced growth rate in recent years as being very significant concerns for all of the individuals of the species.
Could you hear that?
I'm sorry, no.
If we move the
Why don't
owl,
you just come up? Why don't you just come up to the owl?
I just don't want to miss this.
Really
I'm
sorry
going to
about
talk.
that.
No, I'm sorry. I'm going to talk to the owl. Hello, owl. So my concern was that there are a number of peer-reviewed publications that describe poor body condition, reproductive success, prolonged interbirth interval, reduced growth rate, and the body condition compared to the southern right whales. So although those are at the species level, they obviously relate to the individuals as well. And so essentially what we're doing is pushing the assessment of the individual on the researcher, when really the permitting process should consider what I've just listed out. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I would tend to stick with Amy's answer as well, saying that it could be a great moment to discuss that further during that workshop.
Okay. And I think one last, I think Ruth, you had your hand up. Maybe you could talk to the owl too.
Staring at me.
Okay.
I guess mine is related to hearing that there's a concern about the actual robustness of the sample size and the number of permits that are actually being able to be issued. And so that was just my question of putting out of when determining that and the number of permits that are actually allowed.
I guess can you expand a little bit? Well, one of the things I guess I'll qualify is the number of permits that we've authorized is based on what was put forth to us, what was requested in each. So I'm not quite sure what your question is.
It's not really a question. It's just awareness of
I see.
what's the robust number for sample size for a study, knowing there's a certain limit on the actual number of permits that are able to be issued more broadly.
Well, I mean, the limit is right now, we haven't limited anyone, I think we've authorized everything that's been requested. And the limits have to do with more on, no reproductive females, the age class, the body condition of the animal, that kind of thing. But, right now, I think we only have one active tagger right now, HDR out there tagging right whales. But yeah, I think I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, so we're a little bit over, so I think we have to, last word, Laurence.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to mention also that in Canada, at least for the Atlantic coast, we've authorized over the 5 past year, even I was not saying it in my presentation, only 2 permits by year. So this is not that much. I'm fully aware that there are kind of cumulative effects from permits being issued from the United States and Canada at the same time, and certainly we can discuss that. But my point was just mentioning that there are not like a whole bunch of permits issued on our end for tagging of North Atlantic, allowing for tagging North Atlantic right whales. So the maximum permit, I think it was 2 over the 5 last years, and sometimes we only have 1 per year.
Thank you.
Just has a shoe.
Excellent, it's working. All right, good morning again to everybody. This is good to follow the permit discussion with DFO and NIMS. What I'm going to talk about are best practices guidelines that were put forth and published in 2019. And this was from the community of researchers rather than from the permit side. So from the community perspective, there was definitely a need to develop guidelines, best practices if you're going to go out and tag cetaceans. Got the author group listed there, a huge effort on their part. This was really more of a kind of a maybe an 8, even 10-year odyssey of kind of putting the idea forth and really developing. Russ Andrews in the room here in the back, leading that effort. So certainly hats off to Russ, but it was a long effort. Really, discussion started in earnest in 2009 at the NARW Tagging Workshop. There was another workshop for living whales in the Southern Ocean in 2012. Further discussions, and also then at the Marine Mammal Conference in 2013, followed by then the last ONR workshop in 2017, ONR, NOAA, and IWC workshop. So all those workshops were funneling that information into one place. And again, this is the first best practices really for cetacean tagging that has been put together. So really a huge effort for a lot of people. Why do we need it? A lot of are straight from the article. So this is kind of the graph from 1993 through 2018, the amount of tagging for cetaceans that has gone on and been published. And it's just going up and up and up. And why is it going up? Because more and more tags are becoming commercially available. More and more people are being trained to go out and be able to do it. And also, I think on the R&D side, we have to take a little bit of responsibility from our program, for example. We do a lot of tag development, tag technology development, and we absolutely push to make sure that anybody who's developing something is making sure that technology then is available to the community, rather than just so-and-so's got it and they're developing it in their garage and they're doing it just themselves. We want to make sure that the technology is available, and therefore there's kind of a responsibility to make sure that it's used appropriately. So kind of an overview how, what's in these guidelines really. So again, we heard US and DFO, right, in Canada have pretty strong regulatory framework for issuing scientific permits, but that's not the case around the world. So this is really meant to be for global applications. So providing a summary of the key topics to consider before you even go out tagging. And if you are going to do it, what are the best practices? Really kind of a step-by-step process to do that. The guidelines are intended to be a resource for not only researchers, but veterinarians, folks working at institutions, universities, for instance, around this country. They have institutional animal care committees. They're required to evaluate the tagging applications for the welfare of the animal. So again, a great resource for many across the community. So just to take a step back and look at the tags that are being used. So lots of different mentions of tags. So just wanted to walk through what they are and some of the specifics about them. There are tags. When you put a tag on an animal, of course, big ocean animals can take off. So sometimes you need to reacquire those. So there's a radio signal oftentimes that the tags put out. You've got one of those antennas that you got to be on a boat and chasing them down with that radio signal. There are some tags also that are linked to satellite. So you might get a position downloaded to a computer. You can then go out and relocate those animals. Because the next part of that is some of the tags are archival. So meaning the data is stored on the tag, and if you want your data, you've got to get your tag back. So that's why you're chasing down that tag. And also, if you want to do follow-up studies, you want to reacquire where that animal is. That's another way to follow up where exactly that animal.
Yes, the other part of data transmission is satellite transmission. So many of these tags, amazing technology, lots of data streams coming in from various sensors. Algorithms kind of work that data up, and through the very small bandwidth up to the satellite, it's pushing data summaries up. So that is really the way that you get your data, and only way you get your data with some of these tags. So down at the bottom here is a suction cup tag. So in this case, you've got external electronics attached to the animal with suction cups. Most of those are radio telemetry as far as reacquiring and finding those tags, and most of them are archival. There have been some of these tags in more recent years that have been piggybacked with satellite tags in order to reacquire and refine those tags to get them back. But again, archival, you got to get them back to get your data. Type A tags, this is straight from, so the terminology is really pretty critical to make sure that we're all talking about the same type of tags. So type A stands for anchor tags, and this is where you have the electronics external, and you're using a dart into the blubber, oftentimes only into the blubber, in order to hold that tag in place. There's both radio and satellite that you can reacquire that tag, and many of them are satellite links. Some now are also archival in nature, so you do have to get those tags back. So kind of a mix there with anchored tags. And type B tags, we won't talk much about it in this workshop. There's a few that are anchored on the dorsal ridge of animals, a lot more on smaller cetaceans where you have it bolted through on the trailing edge of that dorsal fin. Both radio and satellite to reacquire where those tags are, and most of those tags are satellite transmission of data. And then lastly is the type C for consolidated. That's where the electronics and the body of the anchor are consolidated into one piece. And all you have externally oftentimes is that radio antenna. So they're embedded down into the blubber, usually in the kind of 20 to 30 centimeter range. These are satellite telemeters in order to reacquire those tags. And then you actually, there are some that have radio, but then also almost exclusively data transmission is via satellite. So you're not going to get those tags back. So the guidelines, just the topics that are covered in here, and each of these topics have specific recommendations. We're of course not going to have the time to go through these in detail, but just generally to kind of walk through it is really first starting off again from a community perspective. And trying to understand and do this ourselves, if you will, is looking at the legal and ethical considerations before you even go out. What kind of tag would you use? How would you go about deploying it? If you need to do a boat approach on that animal, the specifics of that. If you do a capture and release, again, that's mostly the smaller cetaceans. And it's come up a number of times as a training and qualifications of personnel. It's a critical aspect of this. Out there doing the tagging. On the other hand, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered around the world. So that pool of folks can't do it all. So we do have to train our next generation. So how do we do that in an effective and responsible way? 2.6 there is a selection of candidate animals. That was raised in the last couple talks related to permitting. And that's actually absolutely on the mind of the taggers when you're out there, is identifying those animals that seem robust, that are complying with your permits, aren't going to be females and things like that. And then the 2.7 is the follow-up studies we'll talk more about in a second. And then lastly, to emphasize here, reporting and data sharing. It is absolutely critical, I think, that that data is made available to the researchers and research community. The PIs who are doing the work, of course, we want to give them room to get their information, their data published. That's absolutely critical for individual PIs. But it's absolutely critical then for that data to be available for the regulator and others as far as assessing that. So data reporting and data sharing is another critical aspect in here. So figure 2 in this thing, in the guidelines, kind of lays out a decision process. Just to, again, mention briefly, talking about initial considerations before, practicalities if you're going to do it, and then if you do it, a phased and iterative approach. Just to take a closer look at these again from a community perspective about the things you want to think about before you even go out there. Make sure your objectives are absolutely clear, right? Tags are the best tool for the job. What are the potential benefits versus costs? And that includes risk to the animals. How likely are you to be successful in doing this and addressing the question of interest, right? Are you able to get enough tags out? We talked about a lot about sample size here. Is tagging the most appropriate approach down there at the bottom? If you go and do it, right, if you're going to do it, it's what's the best tool for the job? What's the most appropriate tag given what you're trying to address or the question you're trying to answer? Where best can you put those tags out? The timing, sample size, we've talked a lot about candidates and tagging protocols. There's a fair amount in there about how to go about putting those tags out, protocols, and then again, the experienced tagging team to go and do it. And lastly, follow-up studies, which I'll mention again. And then importantly, I think this is what a lot of the researchers are doing and is kind of a phased approach. We talked about sample size, and sometimes it's hard to know before you're on the water, well, exactly what is this going to take? Sometimes there's exploratory tagging required to see what kind of variability there is in the system, and therefore how many tags you might need to put out. So a pilot study might be warranted or required. You're going to review those results. You're going to decide if you need to do further tagging and refine your process as you go. And then absolutely stop when you're finished. That might be obvious, but I think it's important, I think, to state that from a community perspective. Last, I wanted to move on to the kind of follow-up studies here, and I wanted to give a shout out to some of the other agencies that we've worked with. Following the 2009 workshop for cetacean tagging, we got a number of agencies, ONR, with a number of agencies across the bottom, BOEM, NOAA, NSF, and one of the oil companies through a connection with the Joint Industry Program, tagged a number of studies under a National Oceanographic Partnership Program. First one, 1A, of course, understanding how these tags, when they work and why they fail, really trying to critically evaluate that. But for the first time, and I think putting for a lot of agencies, including ONR, putting dedicated funding toward those follow-up studies, and that's 1B, to really assess what the potential physical, physiological, behavioral effects are for the animal. And kind of through those studies and through the community over the years, I think there's a number of ways in which they're evaluating the potential effects on the animals. This is one example from the paper of a scoring system. In this case, you're not going to recapture the animal, but you're going to take a picture of that tag site. And there's a number of things that you can look for: swelling, skin loss, exudate, tissue extrusion, and so forth. Depending on exactly the description, you might score that. So this is just one example of what the community of experts have put together of how you could evaluate a tag that's on a whale that's continuing to swim and move around, and you can't recapture it and put it in your hands and really evaluate what the potential effect is of that tag. So a lot of effort to really figure out those the follow-on studies, and can't emphasize the importance of those studies as well. So lastly, as far as what the guidelines are, they really are meant, again, to be a resource for the tagging community, for all the veterinarians out there who are also part of putting this together, for the ethics committees, those institutional animal care committees, and the regulatory staff, right? Their guidelines served in the implementation of the highest standards, promotes training of specialists in this area, and provided standardized terminology so we understand each other when we're talking about all this, and protocols for testing and deployment of various tags. Also, the guidelines have the recommendations specifically emphasizing that the tagging not only should be ethical, but scientifically justified on bona fide research. That was a term used earlier with the NIMS permitting process. And that's absolutely critical, I think, and fairly standard, I think, and certainly folks in the room here, and a lot of folks that we work with, is answering those really critical and important conservation and science questions. And then lastly, these recommendations are there's specific recommendations in there for minimizing the effects on the individual animals, which is critical. And again, improving knowledge about the potential effects of tagging through follow-up studies. So that's kind of a high-level summary of that. I encourage you, if you're interested, to get your hands on that publication. There's a lot more detail in there, but I think that covers kind of the high level. All right, thank you. We have time for questions. I'm not sure who's keeping time. No.
You are.
You'll keep time. Sure, I'll take it. I think we probably do need to move on based on my clock. Okay. All right. So next up, we've got Dave Weller, who's going to be giving a talk. Dave is the director of the Marine Mammal and Turtle Division down at NOAA's Southwest Fishery Science Center in La Jolla. Dave's been doing this work with cetaceans, whales, and dolphins here for about 40 years. So we've got a lot of experience here. Right? All right.
The thing between you guys have you kind of look like you could use a joke. You do both. So let's start. I only have one joke. That's maybe you could volunteer at the end. One wags a tail, the other tags a whale. How appropriate could that be, right? Thank you. I'll pass on your. In the evolution of tagging whales. And this really stems from a review of the workshops that have been done over time. Convergent evolution is happening in real time right here. And we probably could have put together a talk between. And so some.
The sound's really bad right now. We're getting it through the thing. I'm not sure what's happening.
Someone keeps muting us.
So some of the material you will have already seen, but that's just a consequence of not working together. Let me start with the evolution of cetacean tagging and talk a little bit about gradualism and punctuated equilibria. And the gradualism is really Darwinian evolution as things move at a very slow pace over very long periods of time. And I would say that was true for tagging for a very long time. But there's another theory of evolution in which we talk about punctuated bursts of activity, rapid change within the evolutionary system. And that's called punctuated equilibria. And I think that the workshops and the timeline that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to try and hit on both of those concepts. But I wanted to first begin with the 4 boxes on top. I'm going to show you a little bit about discovery marks. Some of you may not know what those are, but they were used between the 1930s and the 1960s. The birth of cetacean tagging really began in the 70s and lasted, I would say the birth process lasted into the 80s. 1983 is the first satellite tag placed on a whale. That was Bruce May. It was on a humpback whale. And then finally, from the 1990s to present, I really think of as an accelerated period of time, a punctuated equilibria, if you will, of tagging and getting to best practices, and some of the things that we're here to talk about during this workshop. Before I go any further, my own tradition is always to acknowledge those that have gone before us in terms of developing things that we're proud to say that are ours today. But there's a list of just a few of the pioneers, and Ken Norris, I think, was really the very first one in the early 1970s. Ken was already on top of this and would have been a great part of the discussion today. These are the discovery tags, and really it's discovering the value of tagging data. That is a tag in the upper right panel, and they were put out beginning in 1932, and that is the start of cetacean tagging, essentially. These were put out by the Discovery Committee, and it was relative to whale catches. They wanted to know more about whales. The discovery type mark, you can see it there. It was quite large, 28 centimeters, including that lead pointed tip. And it had a serial number and a return address. And if you're interested in knowing more about the tags, you can go to Rayner 1940 for information on them. They were embedded in the blubber of free swimming whales with a 12 gauge shotgun. And whalers that actually collected whales, killed whales, brought them on deck. They were reported for returning those tags. And really the data were very simplistic, but they were insightful. That bottom panel shows, if you can see it better, it actually shows where the tag was put in. And then it said, did the whale go north? Did it go south? Did it go east? Did it go west? But you can see over a period of time, they started to collect quite a bit of information, basic information on what whales were doing at particular times of the year. Now let's talk a little bit about gradualism in tag design. This is from the 1970s into the 1980s, really. And you can see all the way back here, Bill Watkins in 1977, he essentially promoted the use of a discovery tag. It wasn't a discovery tag, but you can see the design from 1932 all the way to 1977. Things really hadn't changed very much in terms of the approach. And as you can go through the 80s, into the late 1980s, you see these funky kind of looking tags, remora tags and barnacle tags, and different ways of trying to attach tags to whales, but incremental progress. It was very slow. It was not terribly productive. There were little data return. There were some, but there was little. And so I would consider that to be a period of gradualism in the evolution of tagging. That gradualism, though, did bring the rise of the workshops. Right. And regardless of what you think about workshops, I think there is value in them, in some workshops. And I'm going to try and highlight some of the value that's come out of workshops on tagging in particular. So let's start in 1987. MMS is the Minerals Management Service, which is now BOEM. And they actually asked the Marine Mammal Commission by Bob Hoffman to chair a workshop on possible systems for attaching tags to whales and even small dolphins and manatees and other things as well. So that was very early on, 1987. 1999 was kind of a milestone, I think, in that the New England Aquarium put on a workshop to look at the effects of tags. This was kind of a new thing, and Krause and Quinn and the whole body of folks that took the photographs of animals that had been tagged in the 80s and 90s and started to look at potential impacts. It was, to me, it was a game changer because it took us into the ethical realm about what are these tags doing to individual whales. In 2005, the Marine Mammal Commission, along with NIMS, had a large whale tagging workshop. And I wrote the report for that workshop. It came out in 2008, but really the focus of that report is on effects, follow-up studies, and then even in that report, we talk about a decision-making framework if we were to put satellite tags on Western North Pacific gray whales, which Greg introduced to us earlier. 2009, we had the cetacean tag design workshop, really focused on how to improve and make those tags as best as they can be in terms of performance, attachment, and mitigation of effects on animals. The one in the blue, it's not a workshop, but it was actually an RFP. And Mike just talked about this. And I also think that that was a game changer as well. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But let's move on past the RFP. 2017, there was a joint workshop from ONR, IWC, and NOAA on tag development, follow-up, and best practices. And that's the paper Andrews et al. 2019 that we've just been talking about. And finally, we're gathered here today to talk about all of those things that came before and how to use them moving forward into the future. Towards a common target, systems, designs, and best practices. These are the workshops that I just reviewed that I think have fed into that common target, trying to get at what is the best tag design, whether it's a type A, a type B, or a type C. And the panel below, the two papers that were associated with those tag design and development activities were an IWC report there in the middle. And then on the far right is the Andrews et al. 2019 paper. And then the other workshops were on acknowledging the risk. First, saying there is a risk, right? There is a reaction. Whales do respond to foreign bodies implanted in their blubber or in their skin. And the first to do that, I think, was the New England Aquarium workshops that I mentioned. This report down here, Krause et al., it's sometimes get the year wrong, whether it's 99 or 2000, but it's somewhere in that zone. There was an associated paper by Quinn, actually, that has photographs, tags, and the evaluation process. This paper by Scott, the report by Scott et al., summarized the discussions, but that paper by Quinn, which is not readily available, it's kind of stuck in the grade literature somewhere. But you can get it, and I can send it to you, or anybody can give it to you, but it's pretty important because I think it's the first proper beginning assessment of impacts of tags on whales. And then finally, the report on the right is the Marine Mammal Commission report that I told you about. And I should say, acknowledging those that came before, that report, while I'm the sole author on it, the contribution from Tim Reagan was just out of this world. His mind and his thinking about tagging cetaceans was absolutely incredible. So Tim had a huge part of that, as did Randy and Greg as well. So thank you guys. And I'll send a note to Tim saying that he's here with us in the room, but not today. Now, let's talk about punctuated equilibria. And this, in my mind, and it could be argued, but from 2009 to 2020 is really a period of rapid advancement in our thinking about tag design, tag performance, follow-up studies, ethical treatment. I think it really exploded, and that's how we've gotten here today with a body of knowledge that is so far advanced from where it was before 2009. It really is quite striking when you start to dig through those reports and see the progress at hand. The topics of this RFP that came out of the NARW program, and Mike just talked about it, but it was a large program, a joint collaboration between those organizations listed there in the second line. And it provided about $3 million in funding over 3 to 4 years to advance these topics and subtopics: improving attachment of electronic data loggers, determining causes of tag success and failure, and case studies on impacts. The funding that came out of that RFP actually did a lot to promote suction cap technology, suction cup tag technology advancement, limpet or type A tag technology advancement, and a lot to also promote the evaluation of behavioral, physiological, and demographic effects of implantable tags, type C tags, if you will. And those studies, really great work came out of the Gulf of Maine on humpback whales. That's Juke and Alex. And in the Eastern North Pacific on gray whales and blue whales, and that's John's team put that together for us. And it's very illustrative on what we can expect and what we see when animals are tagged. So thanks for the great part. A carry-on of that original RFP was that ONR in 2013 provided additional funding for more work on type C tag design. Flaws in the existing tag design. With funding from ONR in 2013, they went to work on how to make them better, how to get rid of those flaws. So they're actually a more functional and practicable tag. ONR then also funded in 2018. I'm hoping I'm getting the sequence right, but I think I am. Further follow-up work and performance testing of that redesigned tag, and then assessment of effects of the redesigned tag, all type C tags, so the fully implantable. And then in 2020, ONR finally, they provided an additional amount for further evaluation of those redesigned tag C tags and evaluation of impacts that they may be having. Thank you. You deserve a medal. Sitting down there on the floor. So how does that get us to today, to the species at hand, the right whales? And it does, actually. I'm going to talk a little bit first about the history of tagging right whales, and this work is not mine in any way. It's simply a summary of what's been done to date, and it comes from Amy in the New England Aquarium and DFO and Adele from DFO. And they contributed these summary statistics for me, but this is, the graph got a little bit busy, but there are a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. One, the basic graph shows you from 1988 to 2023, the number of tagging events. And these are attached tags, whether it's satellite tag, radio tags, or limpet tags. So they're attached to the body in some form. Those are the events. The green line up above highlights between 1998 and 2001. What I learned from Amy is that there were 90 tagging events in that period of time of 85 individuals. So that green box kind of highlights that. And then the orange box was the series of tags that the New England Aquarium used for their health effects and impact study between 1988 and 1997. So you can see from that original evaluation period to today, it's been quite a long period of time. In fact, a long period in which there was essentially an unspoken moratorium, I think, on placing tags on North Atlantic right whales. Oh, to illustrate the period of punctuated equilibria, it's that period in the red line, beginning in about 2009 and extending to today. This is a history of suction cup tags on same population of whales. And between 99 and 2001, there were 214 tagging events of 160 individuals. So there are good data out there for us to be answering some of the questions of, do these studies help management, right? I don't know how far they've gotten along those lines, but there are existing data to help us start to ask the questions. Are they helping? What can we learn? There's no question we have a problem on our hand, right? Every single speaker has pointed that out. And this is a little bit dated, but it comes from the NOAA Fisheries website and just illustrates that something needs to be done, right? We need more information on these whales. And I'm not saying that it has to be tagging, but I'm saying that maybe tagging could be part of that, right? And so here is really kind of the conclusion, which you've heard from everybody, is that the cost benefit analysis of tagging in the context of endangered whales really needs to be done. And that's not an easy thing. We went through the exercise with Western North Pacific gray whales, and it takes time. It takes a huge amount of consideration, and it really relies on resources, personnel, and the very question that you're answering, or the question that you're asking, or the questions that you're trying to answer. Those are all really important. So there's no doubt that every day, every year, there is more need to know information coming about. I mean, some of the talks we have this morning about shifting habitat, shifting prey, it's all that ever increasing need to know information. The question is, how do we get to it? And how do we answer that need to know data concern? So you have to weigh the benefits of tagging. And in a case-by-case basis, do they outweigh the associated costs? And associated costs in this case is risk to individuals. And I say on a case-by-case basis because I don't think we can do this in a blanket way. I think it has to be specific to the question, to the species, and the individuals. And you can't just say it's okay across the board for everything, because I think there are cases in which the answer will be no, and there are cases in which the answer will be yes. But I would say that if the answer to the above question is yes, then that multi-context decision-making framework is really essential and is needed. And that's a process in and of itself. It's not easy. It feeds into the permitting regulations. It feeds into the scientific questions, and it feeds into resources. So it's not an easy one. But if the answer in any given situation is yes, the next phase is this decision-making framework exercise. And then you also need to answer, can tags alone answer the question at hand, or do you need tags and other methods in combination? in order to answer. And then that goes into your power analysis of how many tags you need to put out, because you need to know what other studies are going on simultaneously or could be going on. If the answer to the question above is no, we're not going to tag, then I would say that utilization, adaptation, or development of existing or alternative methods, and not necessarily tagging, but I don't know what those methods might be, are going to be needed. And they're going to be needed in a way to answer the need to know questions that you thought, or we thought, or somebody thought might be yes by using satellite tags. So in the end, I think we're all kind of in the same spot. You've seen this convergence of thinking. I think my talk was the last of this morning's session, but almost all of the talks fed into the same target of where we are today. And hopefully that will kick off the discussions for tomorrow and the next day on what do we do moving forward and how do we go about being smart about it. Thanks.
We have time for questions. So any questions in the room here? I'd ask you probably to come up close to the owl so you can be heard. Speak to the owl. Michael, go ahead.
This is just a quick update that the 1999 New England Aquarium Workshop is available online, and it is linked in the additional reading on the final agenda.
Great, thank you. I did want to make a comment too, Dave, thanks for acknowledging ONR's support for kind of follow on from the 2010 NARW. I want to make sure to acknowledge some of the other programs out there. The Navy's, we're the basic and early applied research program. The Navy's 6-4 Living Marine Resources program has also picked up between us and LMR program, continued development on the limpet tag attachments and suction cup tag attachments. So while yes, there's been focus on the type C tags, we've certainly been pushing hard on all the different tag types to be able to hopefully address the questions of interest. So I want to recognize that. Other questions? It's like, oh, Scott, you might have to get up or maybe we can repeat.
I think I can. Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to clarify, I don't think the NOP work that you guys jointly funded included right whales. Is that correct?
I don't believe so. I'm thinking across tag types.
Blue whales, gray whales, and humpbacks.
Right, and the follow-up studies, yeah, all the follow-up studies too, done back on those initial projects. I'm looking at Michael as far as any of the suction cup work. I don't think any of that was from right whales, right? Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think we've got lunch. Do we know logistics for lunch? Yeah.
I believe.
Okay, so we should have the table outside. I haven't gone out, poked my head out yet to see if it's there, but we should have, we're kind of right on time. So I think at 12:15 now, we'll come back at 1:15. So those of you online, if you want to log back in at 1:15, we'll get started. Lunch, we can have, grab your food out there. Feel free to stand, come
I don't even know what to say.
Sucks. Play.
It's close.
We just need one more minute.
Okay. Want to make sure it flashes up.
But I don't know why the screen is on.
I think that was.
Yes, we just want to make sure it's flashing here. That's what it's. Mic and camera. And we have connected via the HDMI here. Like the screen wasn't on a minute ago, right? Correct.
Who wants to chat? So we can remind them. I said we can start.
Sure. Questions in that.
Yeah.
Thanks for your patience. Please, that's all I can see.
What's that say in the chat? Yeah, well, just give it. Give first.
Thank you so much. Okay, so that should work. And then if you have your teams still open. Just so you can, wherever you have teams open, you'll just share. Next to me. Yeah, choose whichever one you want.
So, yeah.
That's so fun.
Yeah. Just for you. On the agendas of fun.
I think it's supposed to be right. That may be a good announcement and to see it brings them in mind a lot better on virtually. That we have to have this. When you go to sign,
So I don't think that you're experienced. You have to get through teams.
I don't know why that. I seem to be. That's right.
So I'll have you disconnect now, but at least how it works. So just make sure you stay logged into the and should be good to go.
It's okay when.
That should be able to hear. Thank you.
You don't want to download it in your.
Sure. I don't think that's what I think.
Good. All right. Anything else, Ruby?
Sarah.
We project on that screen too, or no? Is it, is the system
I
connected?
think it's all connected.
Because some people are in the back of the room saying it's for just this screen, so.
Let me ask quickly.
That's still. Yeah, yeah.
Easy to sneak out. Yes. But otherwise should be good.
Ready to go? Okay, we'll bring up the first poster in just a
Yeah,
second.
they're both virtual, so.
Okay. And get started. Welcome back from lunch. Hope everybody got what you needed. That was definitely a good spread, plenty of food. So, hopefully we got everybody back online as well for this afternoon session. So this afternoon, what we're going to do is dive into the details on the various tag types. So we're going to review all the different tags that have been mentioned this morning. So we're going to have the experts in the field for each of these tag types going through, talking about what species they've been deployed on, how long they're deployed for, the anchor designs, where they're kind of the idea of follow-up studies on what they've done and perhaps suspected effects, and the type of data that can be collected, overall challenges and opportunities. So we're going to run through 3 different tag types, suction cup, and then type A and type C. If you remember those, type A was the anchored and type. So starting us off hopefully here, we've got Alex Shorter from University of Michigan and Susan Parks from tags. What's that?
Or join.
As people join. Yeah.
Right, I see Alex and Susan.
Hey, everybody. Can you guys go ahead and see and hear things all right?
Yes.
Great. Are you all ready for me to get started?
We are ready. Take it away. Yes, just put your
All right.
slide presentation mode.
How's it look? Is it up there?
Yep, you're just in the notes mode, so we don't see, we see all of your slides.
Interesting. Maybe there's a little bit of a delay. Let's try again. Share.
Okay, we now see your screen.
Any better?
Yep. You're good. Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Mike. Like he was saying, I'm Alex Shorter. I'm from the University of Michigan, and I'm tag teaming this talk with Susan Parks from Syracuse University. And we're going to go ahead and talk about suction cup tags. So generally speaking, the advantages of archival suction cup tags could be listed, maybe as some of these points here. They're non-penetrating attachment to the epidermis without direct injury or risk of infection. So we use suction cups to secure these data loggers to the whales because they're high resolution, relatively short-term tags. So we're working up to day scale. 1, 2, 3 days would be like what we would like to be able to go ahead and put on the animals. They're kind of nice too when the whales notice the tags. If we've done too good a job making a suction cup that's provides too much suction, they can go ahead and remove them, and we can get back and start over again, make something that they're not going to go ahead and notice. Like I said, they're intended for short-term high-resolution acoustics or video. The nice thing about these is we've been designing them so that they're reusable. So they're not just one-use things that go out and telemeter data back and you never recover. We can also go ahead and program the tags to release. So this can go ahead and facilitate different kinds of experiments where you're really working to go ahead and have focused, even shorter term deployments. And I think what we're working towards is that we want to get to the point where we can go ahead and make these things relatively inexpensive, so we can make a bunch of them and we can get them out to the community so that you can go ahead and put out lots of tags to go ahead and maximize those opportunities for data collection. What's the main limitation of suction cup tag technologies currently? Well, the attachment times are very variable. They can go from hours all the way to days, and this can be due to cup performance, the condition of the skin. So the same species in different latitudes can go ahead and have different skin conditions, and then that affects the performance of the attachment. Or it could be just the behavioral state. So if you get animals that are in some kind of competitive group, there's going to go ahead and be more contact, and the tags are less likely to stay on. The images here, just if you type in Google now and you say suction cup tags whales, this is sort of what comes up. So it's a snapshot of all of the different tags and sort of different ways to go ahead and put the tags on the animals. And we'll talk a little bit about taking a step back, I guess, the history of suction cup tagging technology. So maybe going back to the first suction cup tags that were deployed by Goodyear in 1981. Then we had a bunch of the critter cams and some of the bigger D tags in the mid to late 90s. And then I've been working on the D tags with Mark Johnson and Peter Tyak and Tom Hurst and all of the other people who have contributed to this since about 1999. So over on the right, you can go ahead and see where we've come from. So we had version 1, which was actually put on a right whale way back in the Bay of Fundy in the late 90s. And then we've progressed through versions 2, 3, 4, and now we're into a new version here in the 2020s. Another commonly used tag that's been out there more recently are these CATS tags. So what was nice about the CATS tags is that they were the sort of the first widely available tags that would go ahead and use cameras coupled with sensors. So there's some little NARW tags and some other electronics that are out there, but they weren't really coupled into a complete system with suction cups. To go ahead and step back, we could talk a little bit about the design and the development of suction cups. So we've had a lot of support over the years. Over here on the left, Living Marine Resources, NSF, the Fisheries and Oceans Canada, DFO, ONR. So we've had funding support to go ahead and try to develop the instrument. And now what we've really been trying to do is figure out how to make this instrument, these suction cup tags, available to the community. So we want to go ahead and increase the number of tags that are out there so people can do more science. And we'd also like to increase equity. We'd like people who have these good science questions to have access to these instruments. So we've created a pool of tags that we're continually refining, that we can go ahead and lease to users in the field. And then we sort of go around this loop. We go ahead and maintain the pool tags so that we can go ahead and get them out there for people to go ahead and use. We get them to the users in the field. Mike talked about what kinds of animals these tags have been put on. They've been put on all kinds of whales, large baleen whales, small toothed whales, harbor porpoise, beaked whales, all kinds of tags all over the world. And then we're always trying to go ahead and improve the tag design. So whether that's modeling, trying to make the tags more hydrodynamic to minimize the loading that the cups have to go ahead and deal with and the loads applied to the animals, or just with the suction cup designs themselves. So this is the mode that we've got, or the path that we've got to try to continue to develop this technology and get it to users in the field. And I think I want to emphasize again over here that it's a huge collaborative team that's been working on not only the technology, but then evaluating the performance in the field, and figuring out how to go ahead and take the instrument, get it onto the animals, collect all that extra contextual information that you need for the science and conservation questions, get the tags back, do the analysis, make the engineering better, and do it again. So that's our design process for one particular flavor of suction cup tag. And I think the last thing that I'd like to emphasize is just how integrated we try to make the design. So the packaging, the cups, the electronics, we really tend to think about it as one tag. And we're trying to go ahead and integrate those subsystems into something that's as compact and efficient as possible. So how do we go ahead and deploy the tags? Well, traditionally, we've used cantilevered poles. And way back in the day, we used long telescoping carbon fiber 10-foot sections. So Michael Moore originally was working on measuring back fat using ultrasound of right whales up in the Bay of Fundy, and he was the first person who put tags on for us. So we mimicked his setup and used long cantilevered poles for a long time, which you can see over here on the left. More recently, we've been moving to shorter hand poles. They just give you more flexibility and the ability to be a little bit more agile when you're out there working with the animals. So you can see a right whale being tagged on the right. But it's still challenging because you've got to go ahead and get relatively close in a small boat, and it requires specific behavioral states of the animals to really go ahead and be successful. So what we've been excited about recently, and I hope this is coming through well. So here's a drone attachment. We've been working to go ahead and develop uncrewed aerial vehicle deployment system that we can use to go ahead and deploy tags on whales. We've been using this mostly on big baleen whales. This has been done in conjunction with Ocean Alliance and the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, where the original team of folks who were putting this together. But the advantage to the uncrewed aerial vehicles is that the drones are so dynamic and they are so fast that you can just go ahead and get to animals so much more quickly than you can in a small vessel. Even though they make noise, the noise is going to go ahead and potentially be less than the noise that we have in the
Yeah, I'm not sure if people can hear me, but I could possibly pick up while Alex is frozen, if that's helpful, just for the sake of time. Okay, I'm going to see if I can share my screen because I have the presentation as well, so I can just pick up where Alex is leaving off. So I don't know if anyone can hear me and see my slide. Okay, great. Well, I will just pick up here. It was actually where we were going to transition between the video drop of the tag from the drones to essentially the types of questions we can answer with these fine scale, high resolution tags. So first, just an example of being able to tie together the fine scale movement and acoustic behavior of individuals with these tags. So on the top, we have a dive profile. This is data from a humpback whale, where we can look at dive profiles through time, but then we can also get synchronous acoustic recordings and movement data. So we can have a 3D reconstruction on the bottom, where we have individual whales coming and doing bottom foraging roles that are associated with the start and stop of a particular vocal behavior. And so the types of details and what the whales are actually doing in a particular location are the types of insights we can get from these higher resolution tags. These tags are specifically designed for shorter deployments just because of the high amount of data and the recording capabilities of the tags. We can't get at this point continuous months-long recording with these types of tags, so the suction cups have been ideal for the deployments. So we can also look at videos of data. This is where Alex's presentation would have been really helpful because this is formatted for a PC. So I can't play the video for you, but it might not have come through anyways. But using fine scale movement and video tags, you can actually recreate the path of the animal. So on the left, we have a video screenshot from a cat's tag. And on the right, we have dive profile information, but a lot of other sensor data from these high resolution tags from a D tag, where we can combine these two types of tag data. We can get video tags that show us what the animals are doing subsurface in terms of detailed behaviors. This video clip was really nice because these humpback whales were diving to the bottom and they were coordinating their feeding with other whales in really close coordination. And so you could see that on the video, and then you could go to sensor data from D tags and recreate that type of scenario with just a sensor-based acoustic tag without video. And so going back and forth between those two types of data sets. So there are also insights that are only possible from acoustic video tag data. And so the types of questions that we would really say these tags are best for are things like wanting direct observation of predator-prey interactions. This is a figure from a recent paper that was published in Science Advances looking at video and movement sensor data from humpback whales, again, foraging. And here you can actually observe animals foraging. You can calculate the number of times they're doing lunges. You can see the prey types that they're feeding on. These are things you wouldn't get from a movement-only based tag. We can also get detailed context, call types, and call rates of subsurface behavior. So we can link individual call rates and call types to the behavioral state of the animal. So then if you have movement-based only tags, maybe you can extrapolate to behavioral context from those more detailed data sets that are smaller. Can also get data on behavioral response to sounds in the environment. So for example, if there's something going on in the environment and you want to look at behavioral responsiveness of an individual whale, you can do either controlled or natural experiments to look at how the animals modify their behavior. And you can actually hear the sounds that they're hearing and the receive levels they're experiencing. Also, we can look at subsurface behavior and behavioral interactions, as I mentioned with the video tags, but also in this paper, they have a nice sort of three-dimensional figure showing the spiral foraging loop of a humpback whale that you can recreate with the tag sensor data. So it ends up getting you a lot of information about the behavioral context of different behaviors of the animals. So for right whales specifically, there have been a large number of suction cup tag discoveries that have been published that have contributed directly to conservation efforts through time. So there have been multiple both controlled and observational studies looking at response to disturbance using suction cup tags, so modification to dive behavior or vocal behavior as a response to sound exposures. There's been passive acoustic monitoring contributions from identifying specific call types, call rates, variation in calling behavior between different age and sex classes that can be important for interpreting long-term passive acoustic monitoring or the probability of detection. Really interesting detailed studies on foraging, so where the animals are in the water column when they're foraging related to prey, but then also the bioenergetics of that and how they capture their prey. And even more detailed things looking at health, energetics of swimming, overall body condition in a range of different locations for North Atlantic right whales in particular. And then some long-term retrospectives using the entire archive that was mentioned earlier of suction cup tags. We can look back through time and answer new questions using the tag archive. We know a lot about the individuals who are tagged, and so we can also try to extract new information out of some of that older tag data. And so I think we just had one last slide that listed all the references, and nobody's going to be able to read it. So I think with that, I can pass it back to Alex.
Thanks, Susan. So I guess we're all done at the end of the presentation, unless there was something that you guys missed when my computer reset.
I think only the videos didn't come through, so.
Can you hear Mike, Susan?
No, I think the computer closest to you is muted, Mike.
You turned it off, put it back on.
Okay, okay. Can you guys hear me out there? Susan? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, so thank you very much for the talk. We do have a couple minutes for questions, and a reminder for everybody who is remote, if you have questions, put them in the chat. And then at 2:30 today, at the end of this session, we'll be able to go into those questions for all the remote guests today and participants. So any questions in the room for Susan and Alex before we move on? All right, Lance, go ahead.
Yeah, of course, these always have been intended to be relatively short duration, hours long tags. What do you think that the positive benefits are of trying to get longer duration of these kind of stadium tags, and what are the limits on that, and what are you kind of shooting for multi-day deployments?
I'll repeat the question for you guys. So the question is about, these are designed for short-term deployments, but what's the goal and target for longer-term deployments with these suction cup tags?
Yeah, I'll jump in and then I'll have Susan finish. So from the engineering perspective, when we started off, 30 years ago, you could go ahead and put a tag on for an hour or 2 hours. So now we can go ahead and measure high resolution acoustic and movement data for up to 4 days. And then even longer if you sample creatively. So I think what we're trying to do right now is work to improve the attachment mechanisms and the recovery mechanisms to really facilitate those longer deployments. So we want the tags to stick on for a day or 2 or 3 days, but then we also need to incorporate telemetry for recovery, not for transmitting data, but for recovery so that we can go back out and get those tags. So I think from my perspective, they're not designed for short-term deployments. We're going to go ahead and maximize. We want to go ahead and keep the tags on the animals for as long as we can record. Susan?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that another aspect of it too, that's sort of salient to the point that was talking about sample size earlier this morning as well. So if you can get multiple tags out in a short period of time, you can get a sample of what the variability is in the behavior in that location, and you can get those data back to look at them. I think that there are different types of attachments and tags that are more suitable for really long-term attachment. But it's also, I think, a logistical question with the suction cup tags as well. They're archival, we need the tags back. And the longer they go, depending if we're talking about baleen whales, if you're talking about 3 or 4 days, the distance that the animals might be for recovery might reduce the number of tags you recover. So typically we've been using them in studies where we're doing sort of focused 24 to 36 hour windows of time that we're wanting to collect data. So we would have the tags automatically detach at that point. So we're not really pushing for like week-long, 2-week-long deployments.
All right, thank you. Thank you, guys. I think in the interest of time, we'll need to move on. Okay. So stepping close to our owl here, so hopefully you all can hear me. So we're going to move on. Again, shorter term, high resolution, lots of data, moving down the spectrum to longer term tags, which are type A, less kind of. First up is Russ Andrews from our Ecotel, coming from the back, and then also John Kalamkitis, his type A type tag. So slides are coming up.
And then just do your best to talk directly to, yeah. Folks were having trouble when you were turning your engines.
It's as if you look at it head on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So, I know there were a few changes. I think I get like 45 minutes, right?
Yeah, good one.
How about Francis? All right, so the committee, who can't agree how much time I get, asked me to talk about a particular type of invasive tag. And I've illustrated a few of them right here. And if I have any time at the end, I'll talk about how we've applied a particular type of invasive type A tag, the limpet tag, to North Atlantic right whales. But first, Mike touched on this a little bit, but I want to go back to just how we classify the tags, because the classification scheme that we put in the best practices guidelines manuscript was really this #1 classification scheme, classifying the configuration of the electronics package and the way that they're retained, or the retention elements, what retains them on the whale. And that's very convenient for lots of reasons, but a perhaps more important way of classifying them when it comes to the point of view of the whale and the impact on the whale is this second classification scheme, which would be classifying tags by the anatomical location of the retention elements. And for example, the most medial or anterior implant depth, because of course they all have something at the surface. Every one of these tags, with the exception of something that I'll talk about if they do let me have 45 minutes, requires a connection to the outside atmosphere, because primarily we're by very high frequencies that can't go more than a centimeter through seawater. So there's always got to be some kind of an antenna that can come to the surface. It can't go through the seawater, and it can't go through the body of the whale. Just to make sure everybody's on the same page with respect to the terminology, I'm going to talk about tag elements, either the electronics package, which is easy with the type A tags, because the classification of type A tags is that the electronics package is always outside of the body of the whale. And then there's retention elements. So with a suction cup tag, the retention elements are suction cups, 2, 4, 11 if you're Japanese. With an invasive tag, then there's some kind of retention element that breaks through the skin at the